Just last week, Netflix launched La Révolution, their new interpretive take on the history of the French Revolution. At least that's what I was expecting it to be. I watched the trailer last week, hoping that we were going to see a bold, dynamic take on the causes and consequences of the French Revolution. Instead, what we were introduced to was a somewhat surreal, perhaps a little bit bizarre, almost zombie horror take on the period, where literally blue-blooded aristocrats demonstrated a cannibalistic predilection for les paysans de France. It's not what I was expecting, anticipating, or hoping for. However, I went into it with sort of eyes wide open, be as positive as I can, and ask the question, despite this being the zombie horror take on the French Revolution, was there anything that we could take from this as historians that might be of use in terms of understanding the context or the way in which the period could be presented? So I'm not going to critique the series based on the acting or the production or the editing or anything like that. There are plenty of other videos that are doing exactly that. What I want to do is look at the series from the perspective of a historian and say, how can this series help us in terms of an education about the revolution, if indeed it can? Now, I went into it trying to be pretty positive, and I'd like to think that I've identified at least 3 parts of the production which feel to me like they could be of use in terms of telling the story of the revolution. One of the ways in which the series opens is with this dramatic scene with this blood-covered horse walking through a scene which is bloody and ruinous. It's an aristocratic landscape which has been burnt to the ground. And we have a voiceover putting the series into context. One of the things that comes out in this voiceover is a narrative that describes the following. They say history is written by the victors. They forget to say it is rewritten over time, transformed by books and reinvented by those who didn't live through it. And I think for where we are at this point in British, European, world history and the way in which we treat history, I thought that was actually quite brilliant. Of course, the reason this series is opening that way is because they've taken a completely revisionist approach to the revolution and put a load of blue-blooded, essentially zombies into the show. I should qualify, I've only seen episode 1, so I don't know exactly where they're going with these kind of zombie aristocrats. But we know there's a supernatural element that's been thrown into it, and almost certainly the way that they're using that particular phrase is to justify what they're doing with the series. However, from the perspective of the historian, given that we are in a time where the whole fake news narrative dominates the way that discussions, not just in relation to contemporary politics are had, but also about historical interpretation as well, I thought this was really interesting. We've seen some really quite striking cultural responses to the Black Lives Matters movement in relation to statues and the way in which history is told around them. And I think this sort of statement, especially this idea that history is rewritten and transformed, especially by those who didn't live through it, is really telling for where we are today, because this is a process that we are constantly engaged with. One of the critiques that we saw against statues being removed was people saying, you can't rewrite history. Well, you can do. Historians, people like me, do it all the time. That's our job. We look again at the evidence and we look at it again and again and again, and we come to different conclusions, and we literally rewrite and reshape history based on evidence, or at least we hope it's based on evidence. So I thought this was a really interesting concept to draw out to the narrative, and perhaps it's going to be something that will be developed in the series in relation to this winners losers narrative, who is controlling the narrative of the revolution. But we'll see as we get into episode 2. One of the other things I thought was potentially really useful was the introduction of this character. So this is Elise de Montargis, who's going to be, I think, one of our main protagonists. One of the striking things that we see with her is an exchange that she has with these two figures. And she's talking about, well, it starts off by overhearing a discussion that these figures have regarding the developing unrest amongst the people in France. And she chimes in with the comment that open the granaries. If you feed the people, then perhaps they won't be hell-bent on violent rebellion. Let's use that word at the moment, because we're some way short of the revolution. This series being set in 1787, so the violent bit of the revolution is yet to come, depending on which version of history that you're choosing to go on. She pitches in with political opinion, but the two aristocrats who she's speaking with casually dismiss her views and say, well, you know what, this is men's business. You're talking politics, so this really isn't something that you should be preoccupying yourself with. And again, that sequence I think is really useful. One of the things I've just been talking with my students at the University of Gloucestershire is the way in which gender plays an important part in the revolution. But important because the dismissal of women is revealing of wider social attitudes at the time in France. You're probably aware of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which comes out during the early part of the French Revolution. But always remember, that was a declaration for the rights of man, not women. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen was something that practically excluded women. Women couldn't be citizens, so they had no real status, and of course women couldn't be men per se, so they didn't have status. Now, that's not to say that there weren't prominent women in the revolution. Of course there were. One of the things I talk a lot about is the influence of the salonnaires, figures who had positions in relative high society, who could shape political discussion, who could influence it. But in terms of whether that was representative of the prominent voices of the revolution or not, it wasn't. This was a male-dominated, or perhaps the better way of thinking about it was a male-controlled conversation that France was having with itself. So there were vocal, prominent female voices, but the cultural narrative was one of suppression, one of dismissal of women's voices. So that one particular exchange I thought was really interesting and revealing of the sort of the way in which society worked in France at that point in time. So again, I think that's quite a useful addition. The other thing that I wanted to mention in relation to the first episode was, if I can find the image, not you, this figure. So this is the character of Orca. This is the figure who, slight spoiler alert here, is the figure who is initially blamed for the cannibalization of the first of the victims that we see in relation to these so-called cannibalistic attacks. Orca is interesting because, of course, he's the addition of a black character into the narrative on the early French Revolution. Now, what I think is happening here, and I haven't seen past episode 1, so I can't confirm or deny this, but what I think is going on here is a narrative, or at least a connection, linking the story to what's going to be happening ultimately in what is now Haiti. Okay, so the French Revolution is important, but the Haitian Revolution is also of major significance historically in terms of the way in which revolutionary sentiment works its way back from the American War of Independence into France and then flowing back through Haiti into Central and Southern America. There's this sort of slow domino effect in terms of the way revolutionary ideas make their way across the globe, sort of backwards and forwards a little bit. I'm taking a leap of faith here in saying that I am almost certain that this is meant to be a Haitian figure. There is reference to voodoo in terms of some of the ways in which he is influencing proceedings around him. He certainly puts guillotine into a sort of a trance-like state, using what we might casually describe as some sort of voodoo or magical practice. What happens with this character, I'll be fascinated to see as we go through the series, or what happens with the narrative there. But this is perhaps opening a door to what's happening in a Haitian context, which is of course going to be of major significance in terms of the global legacy of what's taking place in France over this period. So, okay. there wasn't that much to go on in terms of detail for episode 1. A lot of scene setting, which sort of makes sense. But in terms of 3 themes I think were of interest, or could be of interest to the historian, I think the development of the Haitian narrative could be really interesting. I think reflections on gender is really important, and of course it's being done from a contemporary social context as well. But I think the way it's casting it on the historical period is of value to us from a historical perspective. And I also think the way in which they frame the rewriting of history question is of profound importance, and something we can take away from the series and be quite positive about. Of course, we're still dealing with immortals, and towards the end of the programme we're seeing Guillotine's brother, in theory, come back from the dead and pull some fairly epic immortal single-handed combat to defeat a number of people traffickers, slave traffickers. I'm not quite sure what they are. By the end of the episode they're dead, so perhaps it doesn't really matter. So yeah, this is of course not going to be something that's going to be heavily invested in historical accuracy, but there are some really interesting ideas that perhaps are going to be developed, which I maintain could be of use to us in terms of our understanding of and exploration of ways in which the revolution could be explored. So I'm not writing this off just yet. Of course, there's nothing to evidence blue-blooded zombies in the revolution, but the metaphorical part of it is obviously quite clear. I'll definitely be watching episode 2, and I'll probably do a response and a review to that episode a little bit later on. It's a fairly busy time, so I don't know quite when I'm going to fit it in, but I'll almost certainly do it. But yeah, if you're asking me, do you think it's worth a look? If you are willing to suspend your levels of disbelief, yeah, give it a crack. I think it's an interesting take. A little bit on the nose at times, but there are interesting themes that come through, which certainly as a lecturer, they're themes I deal with in my teaching. So yeah, why not? I think it has potential, and I look forward to seeing episode 2 at some point in the very near future.